Hey there, everybody. This is Congressman Keith Ellison with a special edition of Democrats Live, and coming straight to you from the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. It's really, really critical that we have a substantive conversation about our country, about our core values in light of what has happened in Charlottesville and around the world. Joining me today are some tremendous leaders. I'll start out by introducing 21-year-old Wes Gobar. Wes, he's there. Wes is coming from location in Charlottesville. Wes, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let me also introduce Rabbi Shira. She is the Rabbi Shira Stutman, as she's the senior rabbi at the DC's local 6 and I synagogue. And she's written and talked about these issues of inclusion, justice, and has some special insights that we need to hear. And of course, one of my favorite people, Tom Perriello. We served in Congress together, Tom. I've learned so much from you. And you, Charlottesville is your home. It's where you are from. It's who you are in many ways. Could you set the stage for us, Tom? What the heck happened this weekend?
I mean, it's just soul crushing. Last night's vigil was so cathartic, but we know there's a lot of work to be done. I think it's important for people to understand too, particularly with leaders like Wes that have been out there for a while. This didn't just happen this weekend. Mm-hmm. This was a deliberate 6-month campaign by this new clan, the modern clan, as I call them. They did a torch rally several months ago for the statue. And then they called for a KKK rally last month, which I was also at, and then building to this. So this had been months of creating fear, or trying to create fear, particularly for communities of color in Charlottesville. But it was very different. When I was at the Klan event last month, it was, 35, 40 toothless wonders, to be honest. I mean, it was a group that looked pretty scared coming through, a group of about 2,000 activists. This was a very different scene. This was hundreds of folks out there, faces uncovered, in their uniforms for several hours, just building with tensions, fights. They were yelling the nastiest, most hateful stuff, particularly singling out blacks and Jews, certainly Muslims as well. They
look like soldiers to me.
Well, it was almost like 4 separate costumes. To me, one of the scariest things was that there was an entire unit that was dressed essentially in full camouflage, flak jackets, earpieces, with open carry long guns, AR-15s. And when I walked up, I've been in a lot of conflict zones, as you know. I would have thought they were National Guard at first. So if that had gotten even more violent and shots had started to be fired, I wouldn't have known which people were the law enforcement there to protect us and who was there as domestic terrorists.
Governor McCullough said, somebody asked him why didn't the police act more quickly, and he said, look, 80% of those guys were armed. It could have really escalated in a very negative way if the wrong provocation occurred.
Well, there were a lot of provocations that occurred, and they occurred right in the sight of the police and of those armed militias. It really created a vacuum of that very sacred line between force and violence.
Right.
That's what law enforcement is supposed to be. I was there with some of my siblings who insisted on coming down. So many people from Charlottesville wanted to say, you're not welcome in our town. Yes, we know some of that racism is homegrown. We're not going to deny that. But these were a lot of people from outside coming in.
One guy came from Canada, right?
Yeah. The Vice documentary caught that. And, I talked to a lot of them, and there were a few things I concluded. One, nobody was talking to me about NAFTA and economic grievance.
Right.
They were very clear that this was about white supremacy and tribalism. The level of animosity, quite honestly, towards Jews was extremely clear and came up. I was called a Jew banker, at least a dozen times that day. These were not people looking for a debate or an engagement of that kind. I was really proud of how large and diverse the group of Virginians were who pushed back against that and said, not on our streets. And so, unfortunately, obviously, it ended up being a fatal day. But even before we got to that point, there kept being these beatings. I mean, I had to step in multiple times, and I wasn't in the thickest of the thick. I got pepper sprayed a few times by the Nazis. But, you know, it's one thing in an ice hockey game to let people throw a few punches and then step in and pull them apart, but you still at least know that there's a referee on the ice and there's some sense of law and order. This was something where in almost all cases it was actually a lot of the activists who stepped in and pulled back people from greater damage, which creates, again, a very, very blurry line in there. But it was a very emotional day. I'll tell you what. I mean, I went there, you know, to observe in some ways. I wanted to look in the face of these guys, and I know Wes was in there too, and just see what these people are about. And it is just hate. It is anger. They are looking for a fight, and they genuinely believe if they start a race war that a majority of the white community is going to rally to their side.
I want to ask you about that because, you know, you're a person of European heritage. You're not Jewish. I don't know if you're Catholic or Protestant or any.
Catholic, half Italian, half Irish.
There you go. And, you know, one of the things that strikes me about these guys is that they don't seem to be particularly concerned about white people. Here's what I mean. 10% of all white people in America live in poverty. Of course, more people of color do, but 10% is a lot in the richest country in the world. 14% of white children live in poverty. Now, of course, more black and brown kids do, but 14% is a lot. White, if there's one demographic, Wes, that their mortality indicators are getting worse, it's 50-plus-year-old non-college white men. Even young black men, and I used to be one of them, and Wes is one of them, even though, you know, we know about gun violence and all that, the mortality indicators are improving, but not for this one group in our country. And yet, are they talking about solving the real problems that white people are going through every day, or are they just trying to appeal to hatred?
I think one thing is that, you know, most of the people in the crowd weren't in the 55 age. They were all young, which really struck me, you know, how young these people are. There's a sort of trope that they say racism will die out after.
Not so much, huh?
And this is all, you know, this is all my generation out there. And what I really notice is not just hate, but also insecurity. A lot of the, you know, the year will not replace us. These heckles, they would heckle, you know, people on the sidelines, and a lot of it talked about, you know, how much women they get or their own sexuality, and it really revealed their own insecurities. So I think we have a lot of things converging into why they sort of have been funneled into white supremacy. And it's sad that they're taking that out on other people and sort of been twisted into this warped ideology.
Yeah, well, you know, you were on the scene. What did you see?
I would echo that I saw a lot of these just brawls break out, right? And what struck me was not just what the alt-right was wearing, but how militarily prepared they were. I mean, they had marching orders. They knew like what to do when having these barrages of the water bottles and everything. And I even read some of the Stormfront threads or whatever, and it seemed as if they were preparing for conflict without actually mentioning it. And it seems to me that this is just the beginning of sort of an escalation. I think we'll see more and more of these kinds of things happen, where you have activists have to step in because the police aren't taking action, and the alt-right is bringing their own private security, and that's just dangerous for society as a whole. When, you know, again, the state doesn't have monopoly on force, but, you know, that's going to breed more and more violence, and that's going to be taken out on people of color at the end of the day. So it's sad. And I also saw the alt-right. I mean, we even heard that they were targeting a low-income community called Friendship Court in Charlottesville. And we showed up there, and they weren't there by the time we got there, but we had kind of had to chase around and make sure they weren't doing that sort of thing after the initial rally ended.
Yeah, thank you.
There was this moment, right, this was after they'd broken up, and I was leaving the end of the downtown mall, heading back up to Vinegar Hill Theater. There's a group of about 40 armed Nazis coming around the Omni Hotel, and I was walking up, and there was a Somali woman with a hijab who was just happened to be walking to her job at the Omni Hotel on her cell phone. And so my sister and I went over to say, hey, can we escort you? And she was like, why? What's going on? And it was just this surreal idea where I had to be like, oh, well, there are 40 armed Nazis coming from the downtown mall in this direction. But I wanted to pick up on one thing Wes said about the insecurity point. It was really strong, and it was very dangerous because I think there were a lot of people kind of looking to make a name for themselves, and that's something I've also seen on the Reddit feeds. I actually, kind of partly almost ran a focus group where I tried to test their reactions to certain messages. I will tell you, calling them racist does not bother them.
Right, they're like proud of it.
But calling them traitors, bothers them. But calling them losers gets the single biggest reaction. And particularly when you say, you lost the Civil War, you lost the World War, you're losing this one too. America's too strong for you. That idea of playing into that, I'm not saying we should, but just in terms of understanding their mentality, I think Wes is really on that.
Rabbi, one of the things, many things kind of truly shocked me. The tragic loss of hero Heather Heyer and her mother's, reaction to so many things. The beating that I saw, a young African-American man, the guns, the torches, all shocking. But among the things that shocked me the most is to hear them say, Jews will not replace us. I really think a lot of us want to believe that nobody in 2017 would say such a thing, given 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, given 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. The synagogue that you lead, there must be people in that synagogue who, for them, this is not some sort of a mouthing off theoretical thing. For some of them, it must be quite real.
Yeah, I think when you see the video of all the Nazis marching past the synagogue and screaming out at the people who are praying, because it was our Sabbath, right? Friday night to Saturday night is our Sabbath, and people who are praying in services and saying the most atrocious things to them, it's certainly not something that we could ever have imagined would be happening in 2017, especially because in America, most people think of Jews as in a privileged position, right? So the idea of Jews as being a vulnerable population is something that we have heard whispers of from time to time, but in general, people think that Jews are in a pretty good place. And so it was quite shocking for me personally, and certainly for a lot of my congregants. I mean, this week has been email after email and call after call. As you both know, I know our High Holy Days are coming up in just about a month. And the calls about what is security going to look like at the synagogue? Are there going to be police cars outside? What's going to be happening with the bags when people come into services? I mean, these are all things that we never thought would be happening in 2017, and it's been...
But I mean, look, you might have some people who maybe raised you or raised people in your generation.
Yeah.
So like in America today, people think of Jews as essentially white.
White Jews.
White,
Yeah.
well, people think of them as white people.
Right.
And yet here's the thing. When I was your age, Wes, I spent a year in Poland and Krakow, and there's a city called Kazimierz, and that is a city that if you were Jewish, they'd let you out behind a gate at night, and you had to in the morning, and then by that night you had to be back in that city. You had to wear a certain kind of clothing throughout the day. You were limited to certain kind of jobs, and they did not think of Jews as part of the rest of society. And for somebody who lived that reality, maybe immigrating to America, raising their kids here, but seeing that, again, that must be pretty unsettling.
It's incredibly unsettling. I mean, look, there are a solid minority of Jews are people of color, 20%
no
of
doubt,
the country.
no doubt.
But it is true that this is, in the last 20, 30 years, the majority of Jews have begun to be seen as white people in America. And that is a sea change for us. And it's like the subject of 15 more conversations. And so to have us be put in this category of vulnerable population is incredibly complicated and re-traumatizing to us in all sorts of ways. I mean, we are a traumatized people for better and for worse. And so this really has been in many ways re-traumatizing for us. And hopefully what it will do is just remind us of how important it is for us to be allies to other vulnerable populations, because at the end of the day, we are in this work together in a really important way.
There's I think it's Octavio Paz, when he was talking about the Mexican-American relations over the years, and said Mexicans, the problem with the dialogue is that Mexicans overvalue the past and Americans overvalue the future and undervalue the past, in the sense that people do have very long memories and histories, and sometimes these things can go in cycles, and we have it's so beaten into our DNA in a good way in America that the arc of history bends towards justice, and I think particularly as progressives, we can see that. but the anti-Semitism didn't appear this weekend. We've been seeing threats to Jewish community centers ever since Trump came in the race.
That's right.
That spiked up. We've seen the breaking of the Holocaust Memorial in, I think, Boston.
Twice.
When I was on the campaign trail this spring, we had, we would intentionally go and visit Jewish community centers to try to show solidarity because these threats kept coming in. And it doesn't have to be 50% or 60% that support this. A small number of extremists can make an enormous amount of fear and violence. And I think that the question we will see is, did this fuel that? And my guess is there was a certain number of people there who will never come back to another rally and are on their side, and a certain group that can't wait for the next one. And if there was any hope, as someone who's sort of studied conflict cycles before, if there's any hope of stopping that cycle before it starts, it was going to be unambiguous moral leadership from the top. If Bannon, Gorka, and Miller had been fired the next day, Confederate monuments start to come down, it was clear that this had backfired, then people start to move back in the shadows and say, yes, we were wrong to put our head up. It doesn't go away, but it's a very, very different space. Obviously, that's not the reaction we got.
Well, you're going where I'm trying to lead the conversation. What does it mean that the highest elected official in the United States said that it was both sides when Nazis and Klansmen screaming, Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, hateful things about blacks and everybody else are simply, when he said, oh, they had a permit. Oh, good people were just protesting in favor of keeping the Robert E. Lee statue.
Right.
What does this mean when our top elected official in the nation is saying these things?
I want to answer this question, but also tie into something that Tom said, about conflict cycles, which is that I think we need to recognize this is a uniquely American form of terrorism. Before this rally, I was actually studying the 1887 Thibodeau massacre in Louisiana. So, you have dozens of these race riots in our history where sort of you have an advancement towards racial justice or some sort of dismantling of white supremacy, like we saw here with the move to take down the statues. And there's this backlash, and it's violent. And real leadership, if you look at, for example, President U.S. Grant, he cracked down on the KKK, or Eisenhower with the National Guard. That is what real leadership is. And when you have that absence of leadership, when you have someone allowing space for these white supremacists and approval, then this violence is going to get worse. And that's just so disheartening. And we saw the attack in Spain today, and the U.S. is abdicating moral leadership now by hit Trump's horrible response to Charlottesville, and now I don't know how he can respond to what happened today either. So this is definitely going to have a lot of effects.
Well, so there's Trump. What does it mean that, I'm going to be very candid. What does it mean that only about 12 or 13 Republicans, members of Congress, have said that this is that Trump's position saying that it's both sides is ridiculous? How come they have not said, Mr. President, it's not both sides. One is the KKK and the Klan, and one are protesters. What does that mean, that even members of Congress aren't stepping into it?
Yeah, I think it's important we all know this, but to remember, and the images tell this, what it would mean to stand in the middle of that square that day. Mm-hmm. You would have had to walk through a group of white nationalist armed militia, a group of people with swastikas, a group of people with Confederate flags, mm-hmm. a group of people yelling everything from death to people of different sexual orientations to the Jews, you name it, to be in that square. And that footage was extremely available to President Trump by the point that he made those statements, to say there were some good people in there. And, I do think at some point we have to stop thinking he's misspeaking, mm-hmm. stop thinking that he is just too arrogant to admit an error. There is an old, Occam's razor principle, which is what's the most rational, explanation. And if you look at the pattern of behavior, whether or not, his father was in the KKK rally thing back in the day, he is acting the way a white supremacist would act in office in what he says. His comments were off the cuff. When you make off the cuff comments, they tend to reveal, your thinking. But I do think it's a teachable moment for us, because there are a lot of people, particularly in the white community, who've been in the classic middle of saying, look, I don't like the Confederate statues, but let's not cause trouble. It's part of our history, etc. But I think what we've seen is allowing not just one or two statues, but the propagation systematically of thousands of statues, most of which were put up, as Wes mentioned, in the reaction to African-American progress at moments like the segregation fight, at the moments like Woodrow Wilson firing African-Americans from the federal workforce and airing Birth of a Nation in the White House. That's when the Lee statue went up in Charlottesville. It was after that. It wasn't after the Civil War.
Yeah, this was in 1866.
The KKK was there at the dedication, and they actually sent a check to UVA.
And so when we understand that history, think about it. I mean, for me to grow up in Charlottesville, sure, I know the slavery thing, but if you look around and you've got Lee statue and Jackson, and I'm in the Stonewall Jackson Area Council, and you drive on Lee Highway to Jefferson Davis Highway, and you're still celebrating Lee Jackson Day, we're still the only state that does that, some part of you has to internalize the idea of the lost cause, of the Dunning School kind of theory of Reconstruction, which only got 3 paragraphs in my textbook growing up. So, you know, when you think about that, that's what allows someone like Donald Trump to say the stupid ahistorical stuff that he said. Because why else? What other civilized country in the world would propagate that level of memorialization of something if it was just tragic heroes in the name of a bad cause? So I do think, you know, we have to look at, and I talked to some of the Nazis about this, the fuel for them coming there was not West Bellamy and the agitators taking down the statues. The fuel for them was how many white people were siding with them, quote unquote, on wanting to keep the statues. And that plays into that sense.
Rabbi,
I also want,
let me hang on, Wes.
Yeah, go for it.
Rabbi, what does moral leadership call for in this moment?
Well, I do think part of moral leadership is stepping into the vacuum that the president and other of our elected leaders are unfortunately leaving. And by the way, other very prominent Jews, like the Kushners, are leaving wide open. There's unfortunately, a lot of room for moral leadership. I think it needs to happen in a number of different ways. I think part of it is speaking to the fear that has been stirred up in the Jewish community, in others' communities, and just allowing people to sit a little bit in that fear, because otherwise our fear too can metastasize the way it has for people, for some of these Nazis, and become something much more violent and insidious. I also think speaking a little bit of truth to power and continuing to call out people who are either saying horrible things like what the president said or saying nothing at all. And I also think there's something about trying to find a new path forward, right? A path of more positivity, a path of what our country could look like, in addition to not only the horrible ways that our country looks right now. What do we want our country to look like in the 21st century, and how can we move it toward that ideal, toward that vision? I mean, we are supposed to be an exceptional country, so what would that look like for us?
Good question. You know, actually, President Obama tweeted something
right.
that was said by Nelson Mandela. Maybe we can get that up right now. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or her skin or his background or religion. People must learn to hate. And if they learn to hate, they can also be taught to learn to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Actually, Nelson Mandela said that, but Barack Obama tweeted that on August 12th at 7:06 p.m. And it looks like more than 4 million people liked it, and more than 1.5 million people retweeted it. And I'm told that it's one of the most retweeted ever. So that's I think you know, an important lesson as to what leaders should be doing. As you said, Tom, you can't stop bad people from doing bad things, but leaders can step up into the moment. Anybody want to elaborate on this point? Wes, you were trying to say something?
Well, what I did want to say is that I want Donald Trump to look in the face of my friends who were hit by the car, my friends who were hospitalized, my friends who were at the statue facing hundreds of white supremacists, and to say they were both sides. That to me is just ridiculous. And I'm thinking about all those people who were hurt and affected that day and who had to stand up against hate. And to say they were both sides is unacceptable.
There were, just to pick up on that, Wes, there were heroes there.
Right.
Not only was
Let's
it
hear
not
about
that
some
they
of
were,
them. Well, like, we know about Heather Heyer.
Right.
But there were probably other heroes who managed to survive this thing.
Yeah,
Share about them.
Wes will probably want to talk about the students that surrounded the statue. There was also a professor who's actually subsequently had a stroke who stood up to Kessler at his press conference the next day.
Jason Kessler.
The white supremacist who organized the event. It was actually an interesting moment. I was down there for that too, where a group of people with trombones and tubas were drowning out the press conference. And it does raise these issues. Yes, he had the right to stand there for a press conference, but also the community had a right to drown out that hateful speech with love and community. And I know he's a hero. Obviously, Heather is lost her life coming out to stand for racial justice as well. There were clergy there of all races to stand and make clear that we're going to be a loving and inclusive community. What you didn't see and what you haven't seen, in addition to any leadership from Donald Trump that I think we have to call out, is any white evangelical leaders calling out this hate. In fact, as far as I know, as of today, the business CEOs have stepped away and shown more moral leadership than the Evangelical Council. And I would say any white pastor or priest or reverend this weekend that does not talk about white supremacy as blasphemy, as a sin against the image of God in another person, is part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Well, I think you're right, man. And one of the things that we're asking for is for people to call. You can call members of Congress, you can call politicians, you can call religious leaders and say, look, now is the time to be counted. You must say that it's not both sides. The Nazis and the Klan are evil. And let me just add,
we got to set the bar higher than that, though.
Well, no, you go for it.
It's the first step.
Yeah, it is important. The statues are important. I really do think civilized countries from Germany to South Africa have done.
Angela Merkel weighed in on this.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission is what I think we need in this country. I think we need it in Virginia. That is something that is a public and systematic approach so that these are not one-off fires in each community, but an actual process. I have feelings about what the outcome should be, but the process is part of that, of bringing communities together. And the other thing, since we're here at the Democratic headquarters, I'll just say, is that elections matter. As I said to you before, if Hillary Clinton had won, it wouldn't have been the end of racism and sexism. But the fact of the matter is, those people in that park felt validated to hate and to attack. They were very clear that Trump was their leader. They chanted Heil Trump. I had to sit there and hear people chant Heil Trump.
Heil Trump, yeah.
And, we have an election in Virginia this year. It'll be the first statewide election of the Trump era. And I think that question is, can we turn resistance energy into power at the ballot box?
You got to do it at the ballot box,
and we got delegate races that are up. Again, that's not going to solve it in a single election cycle. But all of these things matter, I think. The way we tell our history, the way our faith leaders speak out, but also whether we turn this into a political voice.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me is that, being from Minnesota, the first Minnesota was a regiment that volunteered to fight the Civil War early on, and then we lost about 70% of that regiment in Gettysburg. And on the other side of that battle line was Robert E. Lee and that damn Confederate flag. And my father was a soldier in World War II. And, in that conflict, the Allied powers were fighting against the Nazis who had that swastika that they were waving around. And so it strikes me is that, yes, these are traitors. How dare they say that they're true Americans? They are the last thing. They are the last ones. I mean, that strikes me. I mean, that thought alone ought to impact these evangelical leaders who you're talking about. And I do hope they find their moral center. I mean, it was
in my focus group. Traitors came in second to losers in terms of things.
They'd rather be traitors than losers.
But
they'd rather be. Yeah, Wes, you want to get in here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that what is American, and their sort of conception of that is white identity. But you have these people marching through grounds, the grounds that were built by African American slaves, right? So that idea of what is American, you have to. They can't reconcile that with the people who built this country, the people who actually put in the work and have made America great.
Yeah.
I think that's such an irony. And you also had, those students surrounding a statue of Thomas Jefferson, who is also a symbol of white supremacy in many ways, but with a different legacy.
I think that's true, and it's so interesting to me. And I'm thinking about the exchange that happened last week or the week before. I mean, time is moving, about the Statue of Liberty and what that represents, and whether it actually represents the ingathering of immigrants.
Right. Stephen Miller wanted to say, "Oh, it was added later."
It was added later. It's about liberty,
Dismissive.
and I think we have to really think about what is America about, and what it is about is reconciling to some of our original sin and really trying to understand that as a country, and also the fact that we are a country of immigrants and we are a country of diversity, and that is what we are most proud of. And this sort of history or a history that some of these Nazis are bringing to the fore is just, it is so not a part of what the American ideal has ever been.
What about liberty and justice for all?
Right.
I mean that speaks to me. I mean, one time I just sat down and disaggregated that Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah.
One nation, indivisible.
Yeah.
I tell you, we do have to contest this idea, Wes, and I don't think there's any reason to concede it to these guys. And let's just remember, as we say, America's a nation of immigrants, it's also a nation of the indigenous First Nations. Mm-hmm. And it's both of those things. And so I will just tell you guys, we're getting close to the end, but I do want to mention to you that we are asking folks to rise and organize. Please use the hashtag Rise and Organize. As you go out and organize this weekend, post it, tweet it, say Rise and Organize. Our response from the Democratic Party is we're not just gonna duck and cover. We are gonna rise and organize, and this is very important, and we need everybody to do it. This weekend we have a weekend of action. We have 160 separate events, 160 separate events all over the country, and we're asking people to remember what happened in Charlottesville. Cling to this hard-fought idea that we are all a part of this country. There are no second-class citizenship. People fought and died to make sure they weren't, and we're not going back to the bad old days. And we also want people to call their representatives and ask them to denounce Trump. I agree with you, Tom. The bar that's too low. That's not good enough. But I will also say this for that action. We're now arguing over whether water is wet. We need to say water is in fact wet, and the Klan and the Nazis are unacceptable and have no place. Although, I hope y'all listen to what Tom said. I like that idea of truth and reconciliation and the ideas that you pushed. And I just want to say to you guys, as we wind out, you can get involved in one of these 160 events I mentioned if you dial 433-67, type in the word resist. You can get information coming up. I also want to say we want to thank all the people, Heather Hayer and her family, all the people who were injured. We want to wish them the speedy recovery. We want to thank you, Tom, for your tremendous commitment to human rights over a lifetime. Wes, I think all of us at this table look at a 21-year-old guy like you and we think, hey, man, the future's bright. We're going to be okay because Wes is out there and he's not by himself. And Rabbi Shira, I want to just say blessings to you and your congregation. Thank you. And I want to just say to you that all of us are with you, and we will always stand with our communities, all our communities who are under attack. And I just want to tell with you, just in the spirit of solidarity, as they're yelling out horrible things like Jews will not replace us and other horrible anti-Semitic things, at a mosque about less than a mile from my district, they actually had a terrorist bombing at Dar al Farouk, and the president did not denounce that. And he said not a word about that, Wes. So there's a whole lot of consent as silence going on. We cannot tolerate. Hey, look, on behalf of our chairman, Tom Perez, this has been a special edition of Democrats Live. We're joined by DNC member Yasmin Tayyib, who's joined us today, and we're very proud that she's here. She came in special because she wanted to be here, and we're proud of that. And on behalf of the staff of the DNC, every Democrat across the country, remember, you joined the Democratic Party because your commitment to human rights and values led you to it, and you wanted to be with some people who were working on that project too. And this is the moment to remember that the Democratic Party does not exist for Democrats. It exists for the American people. This is a patriotic moment where you put it all out there for the good of the nation. Again, this has been a special edition of Democrats Live, and I just want to thank all of you guys for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.